It was the sound of my sister's laughter coming from the basement that shattered my world. My husband's laughter, too, mingled with hers like a cruel melody. I never expected to find them there, night after night, plotting behind my back. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife ever could. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and at 72 years old, I thought I knew what love looked like. I thought I understood family. I thought the people closest to me would never hurt me in ways that would leave scars on my soul. But I was wrong about so many things. Every morning, I wake up in my small Queens apartment to the same routine. The coffee maker gurgles to life at exactly 6:30. The smell of brewing coffee mingles with the faint scent of the lavender sachets I keep in my drawers, a habit I picked up from my mother decades ago. My bones ache more each day, especially in my knees and hands, reminders of all the years I spent taking care of everyone else before myself. I shuffle to the kitchen in my worn slippers, the ones with the little tear on the left toe that I keep meaning to replace but never do. The morning light filters through the sheer curtains, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor that's seen better days. I take my blood pressure medication with a glass of water, then make my simple breakfast: 2 slices of whole wheat toast with just a thin layer of butter, and a small bowl of oatmeal with cinnamon. After breakfast, I water the plants by the window. 3 small pots of African violets that refuse to bloom no matter how much care I give them. They sit there, green and stubborn, like silent witnesses to my daily solitude. I talk to them sometimes, telling them about my dreams or complaining about the noise from the apartment upstairs. They listen better than most people in my life. Then comes the waiting. The awful, endless waiting for the phone to ring, for someone to need me, for some sign that I matter to the people I love most in the world. But lately, the silence has been broken by something else entirely: muffled voices drifting up through the floorboards from the basement. Voices that make my skin crawl and my heart race with a fear I can't quite name. I remember when I first moved into this apartment with Thomas, my late husband, and my sister Anna. That was 12 years ago, after we decided we could save money by sharing expenses. The apartment had just been painted, and everything smelled fresh and hopeful. We hung pictures on the walls: family photos, wedding portraits, images of happier times when we all believed in forever. There's a black and white photograph on my mantelpiece that haunts me now. It shows Anna and me as little girls, maybe 6 and 8 years old, holding hands in front of our childhood home in Brooklyn. Our mother had dressed us in matching white dresses for Sunday service, and we're both giggling at something our father must have said behind the camera. Anna's gap-toothed smile mirrors my own, and our eyes sparkle with the innocent joy that only children possess. Looking at that photo now feels like staring at strangers. Where did that laughing little girl go? When did my sister's eyes turn cold and calculating? When did her love become conditional on what I could give her? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how the cracks in my perfect family picture started to show. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning in March. I needed Anna to pick up my prescriptions from the pharmacy on Northern Boulevard. My arthritis was flaring up something terrible, and the walk there would have taken me the better part of an hour in the cold wind. I sent her a text message at 9 in the morning. "Anna, could you please get my medicines today? My knees are acting up." By noon, no response. I called her cell phone, and it went straight to voicemail. Her cheerful recorded voice mocked me. "Hi, you've reached Anna. I can't come to the phone right now, but leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can." But she never got back to me. Not that day, not the next. By evening, I began to worry. Had something happened to her? Was she okay? I knocked on her bedroom door. She lived in the back bedroom of our shared apartment, but there was no answer. The door was locked, which was strange because Anna never locked her door during the day. That's when I heard it for the first time. That giggle. That familiar musical laugh that belonged to my sister, floating up through the floorboards like a ghost from the basement below. And mixed with it, another laugh I knew by heart, Thomas's deep chuckle, the one that used to make me feel safe and loved. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand still raised to knock on Anna's door, listening to the sound of my sister and my husband laughing together in the basement. The basement we never used for anything except storage. The basement that was supposed to be locked because Thomas said the stairs were too dangerous for an old woman like me. The smell of mildew and old secrets seemed to seep through the wooden floors, mixing with the familiar sense of our home and turning them sour. My stomach churned with a sick feeling I couldn't identify yet. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. But I pushed the feeling down, the way I'd learned to push down so many uncomfortable truths over the years. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself there must be an innocent explanation for why my husband and sister were meeting in secret, laughing together while I sat upstairs alone, forgotten and ignored. I went to bed that night with questions buzzing in my mind like angry bees, but I didn't have answers yet. I didn't know that the sound of their laughter was just the beginning of a nightmare that would nearly destroy me. Over the years, I had given everything to keep our little family together. When Thomas lost his job at the construction company 3 years ago, I didn't hesitate to dip into my retirement savings to cover the mortgage. $5,000 the first month, then $3,000 the next, then whatever was needed to keep us afloat. "It's just temporary, Eleanor," Thomas had promised, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he signed the withdrawal papers at the bank. "Just until I find something else. You know I'm good for it." I believed him because I wanted to believe him. Because the alternative, that the man I'd loved for 43 years might be lying to me, was too painful to consider. When Anna's youngest daughter needed money for college textbooks, I didn't hesitate to hand over $800 from my pension check. When her car broke down and she needed $1,500 for repairs, I wrote the check without question. When she asked to borrow money for Christmas gifts for her grandchildren, my great-grandchildren whom I rarely got to see, I gave her what she needed, even though it meant eating pasta and canned soup for the rest of the month. "You're such a lifesaver, Eleanor," Anna would say, kissing my cheek with lips that felt cold against my skin. "Family has to stick together, right? Blood is thicker than water." Family. The word that became both my blessing and my curse. The word they used to manipulate me, to make me feel guilty for wanting anything for myself. The word that kept me trapped in a cycle of giving and giving until I had nothing left to give. I cooked dinner every night for all of us, even when my arthritis made it agony to stand at the stove. Pot roast on Sundays, spaghetti and meatballs on Wednesdays, chicken casserole on Fridays. I'd set the table with my mother's good china, light a candle, and wait for them to come home and appreciate the effort I'd made. But more often than not, they'd grab their plates and disappear into their rooms, leaving me to eat alone at the dining room table, staring at the empty chairs and wondering when I'd become invisible in my own home. I cleaned up after them without complaint. Anna's coffee cups left rings on my wooden furniture. Thomas's muddy work boots tracked dirt through the house that I'd spend hours scrubbing from the kitchen floor on my hands and knees. Their dirty dishes piled up in the sink until I couldn't stand it anymore, and washed them myself, my swollen fingers aching as I scrubbed away the remnants of meals I'd cooked that no one thanked me for. I forgave every slight, every broken promise, every moment of thoughtlessness because that's what good women do. That's what my mother taught me. That's what I thought love looked like. Endless sacrifice, endless forgiveness, endless hope that someday, somehow, things would get better. But they never did get better. They only got worse. I remember one particularly painful evening last Christmas. I'd spent all day preparing a special holiday meal. Honey-glazed ham, mashed sweet potatoes, green bean casserole, and my famous apple pie that used to be Thomas's favorite. The apartment smelled like cinnamon and nutmeg, and I'd decorated the table with the red napkins and gold chargers I only brought out for special occasions. "Anna, dinner's ready," I called from the kitchen, wiping my hands on my apron. The ham was perfect, golden and glistening. The pie was cooling on the counter, its flaky crust exactly the way my mother had taught me to make it 60 years ago. But Anna didn't come. Thomas didn't come. I waited 20 minutes, then 30, then an hour. The food grew cold. The candles I'd lit burned down to stubs. Finally, I knocked on Anna's door. "We're not hungry right now, Eleanor." Anna's voice came through the door, sharp with annoyance. "We'll eat later." Later. Always later. I wrapped the food and put it in the refrigerator, where it sat for days before I finally threw it away, untouched. I ate my Christmas dinner alone at the kitchen counter, standing up, too tired and heartbroken to bother with setting a place for myself. That night, I overheard Anna on the phone with someone, her voice carrying through the thin walls of our apartment. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was just getting a glass of water from the kitchen when her words froze me in place. "She's so pathetic," Anna was saying, her voice filled with cruel amusement. "Cooking all day like we're some kind of happy family. She has no idea how suffocating she is. Always wanting to please everyone, always trying so hard. It's embarrassing." The glass slipped from my hand and shattered on the kitchen floor. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet apartment. But Anna never stopped talking, never came to check if I was okay. I stood there in my bare feet, surrounded by broken glass, feeling like something essential inside me had shattered too. I cleaned up the glass with shaking hands, careful not to cut myself, though part of me wondered if it would matter if I did. Would anyone notice if I was hurt? Would anyone care? That was the night I started to realize that the people I loved most in the world saw me not as a person, but as a resource to be used. Not as a sister or a wife, but as a wallet with legs, a servant who worked for free, a convenience they could take for granted because I'd trained them to expect nothing less. But I still couldn't bring myself to stop. I still couldn't say no. The thought of being alone, of losing the only family I had left, terrified me more than their treatment of me. So I swallowed my pain and kept giving, kept hoping, kept believing that if I just tried harder, loved more, sacrificed more, they would eventually see my worth. I was so wrong it hurts to think about it now. The microaggressions came daily, like paper cuts that seemed small individually, but together left me bleeding from 1,000 tiny wounds. Anna would sigh dramatically when I asked for help with simple tasks. Thomas would roll his eyes when I suggested we do something together, like take a walk around the neighborhood or watch a movie. "You're always wanting something, Eleanor," he'd mutter, not looking up from his newspaper. "Can't you just be content with what we have?" But what did we have? What did I have? A roof over my head that I paid for with my retirement savings. The privilege of cooking and cleaning for people who barely acknowledged my existence. The joy of giving my money away to family members who saw me as nothing more than an ATM they didn't even have to thank. My birthdays became exercises in heartbreak. I'd wake up on the morning of my special day with a flutter of hope in my chest. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe they'd remember. Maybe they'd care enough to make even a small gesture to show they valued me. But 70 came and went without so much as a card. Anna claimed she'd forgotten, and Thomas said he thought my birthday was next week. They both promised to make it up to me, but they never did. I spent that evening alone, eating leftover casserole and watching old movies on television, trying to convince myself that birthdays didn't matter at my age anyway. 71 was worse. Anna was out with friends she never introduced me to, friends whose names I didn't know. Thomas was watching a basketball game and got irritated when I tried to sit with him on the couch. "Can't you see I'm trying to focus here?" he snapped. "Go find something else to do." I went to my bedroom and cried into my pillow so they wouldn't hear me. At 71 years old, I was crying alone on my birthday because the people I'd devoted my life to couldn't be bothered to spend an hour making me feel special. But it was my 72nd birthday that broke something inside me permanently. I'd learned my lesson by then about expecting too much, so I didn't mention the date to anyone. I just went about my normal routine: coffee, medicine, watering the plants, waiting for someone to acknowledge that this day was different from any other. By evening, it was clear that nothing was going to happen. Anna was in her room with the door closed. Thomas was asleep in his chair, snoring softly while the television droned on about things I didn't care about. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, looking at the calendar on the wall where I'd circled the date in red pen weeks ago. Today, 72 years ago, I'd been born to parents who loved me, who celebrated my existence, who made me feel like I mattered in the world. Now I was just a burden, a forgotten old woman whose life served no purpose except to make other people's lives easier. That's when I heard them again, the voices from the basement. Anna's laugh, followed by Thomas's deeper chuckle, then the sound of footsteps moving around on the concrete floor below me. This time, I didn't ignore it. This time, I needed to know what they were doing down there, what they found so amusing while I sat upstairs alone on my birthday, forgotten and invisible. I found the basement key in the junk drawer where Thomas kept it hidden under old batteries and rubber bands. My hands trembled as I unlocked the door and started down the wooden stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The basement smelled like damp earth and old cardboard, with undertones of something else I couldn't identify. Something sharp and medicinal that made my nose wrinkle. The voices grew clearer as I descended. Anna was speaking in low, excited tones about the next shipment and keeping her upstairs happy. Thomas was talking about numbers, about money, about quantities of something that made my blood run cold. At the bottom of the stairs, hidden behind stacks of old boxes and forgotten Christmas decorations, I saw them. My sister and my husband, bent over a folding table covered with pill bottles, prescription pads, and stacks of what looked like official documents. But it was the pregnancy test sitting on the table that caught my eye first. The little plastic stick with its blue lines that spelled out pregnant. Impossible, since Anna had gone through menopause years ago, and I knew she wasn't sexually active. "What are you doing down here?" I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. They spun around like guilty children caught stealing cookies. Anna's face went pale, then red, then pale again. Thomas's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence stretched between us like a live wire, crackling with tension and unspoken truths. Then I saw the rest of it. The prescription pads with doctors' names I didn't recognize. The bottles of pills that looked identical to the ones I took for my blood pressure and arthritis. The checks, my checks, with my signature forged in handwriting that looked convincingly like mine but wasn't. Bank statements spread across the table showed withdrawals I'd never made, deposits I'd never authorized, investment statements for stocks and Bitcoin accounts I'd never opened, assets worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, all in my name, all managed by people I'd never met. "Oh my God," I breathed, the pieces of a horrible puzzle finally clicking into place. "You've been stealing from me. All this time, you've been stealing from me." Anna recovered first, her face sliding into the expression she'd perfected over years of manipulation. Part innocence, part wounded victim, part righteous indignation. "Eleanor, honey, you don't understand what you're seeing," she said, in the soothing tone she might use with a confused child. "We're helping you, managing your finances so you don't have to worry about complicated things like investments and cryptocurrency." "Managing my finances?" I repeated, my voice growing stronger despite the way my entire body was shaking. "With forged prescriptions? With pregnancy tests? What does any of this have to do with managing my finances?" Thomas stood up slowly, his face harder than I'd ever seen it. Gone was any pretense of the loving husband. In his place stood a stranger whose eyes were cold as winter. "Eleanor, you're old," he said bluntly. "You don't understand modern financial instruments. Anna and I have been investing your money, growing your wealth. We've made you rich beyond your wildest dreams. You should be grateful." Grateful. The word hit me like a slap across the face. Grateful that they'd been stealing from me, lying to me, manipulating me while I cooked their meals and cleaned their messes and gave them every penny I had to give. I picked up one of the bank statements with trembling fingers. The account showed a balance of over $2 million, money that belonged to me but had been invested in stocks and cryptocurrency without my knowledge or consent. Money they'd been using to generate wealth while telling me I was barely getting by, while letting me sacrifice my pension checks and retirement savings to pay for groceries and utilities. "How long?" I whispered. "How long have you been doing this?" Anna and Thomas exchanged a look that told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't recent. This wasn't a desperate measure taken in a moment of financial crisis. This was systematic, planned, long-term theft and manipulation that had been going on for years. "Since your mother died and left you that inheritance," Anna said finally, "we've been managing it responsibly, making smart investments, growing your wealth. You were never capable of handling that kind of money on your own." My mother's inheritance. The $50,000 she'd left me when she passed away 5 years ago. The money I thought had gone to pay for her funeral expenses and medical bills. The money Anna had volunteered to handle for me because the paperwork was too complicated and I was too grief-stricken to deal with it properly. They'd taken my mother's final gift to me and turned it into a fortune I never knew I had, all while letting me live like a pauper, all while making me feel like a burden for needing basic necessities. "The pregnancy test," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's the pregnancy test for?" Anna's cheeks flushed deep red. "Insurance fraud," she admitted. "Fake pregnancies generate medical claims. We've been using your insurance information to file false claims, then splitting the payouts with a doctor who signs off on everything." The room spun around me. I gripped the edge of the table to keep from falling down. Not only had they been stealing my money and investing it without my knowledge, but they'd been using my identity to commit insurance fraud. They'd been putting me at risk of criminal charges while I lived upstairs, oblivious and grateful for their care. "You're criminals," I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "You're both criminals, and you've made me an unwitting accomplice." "We're family," Thomas said, as if that explained everything. "Everything we've done has been for the good of the family. You'll thank us someday when you realize how wealthy we've made you." But I already was wealthy, and I'd never known it. While I'd been rationing my grocery budget and wearing the same clothes year after year, they'd been living comfortable lives funded by investments made with my money. While I'd been giving them my pension checks to help with expenses, they'd been depositing the profits from my unwitting investments into accounts I couldn't access. I sank into an old folding chair, my legs no longer able to support the weight of what I'd learned. The teacup I'd been holding, I don't even remember bringing it down to the basement with me, slipped from my fingers and shattered on the concrete floor. The sound seemed to echo forever in the damp space, a percussion of broken trust and shattered illusions. That's when I started to cry. Not the quiet, dignified tears of a sad old woman, but the harsh, ugly sobs of someone whose world has collapsed around her. I cried for all the years I'd felt guilty for being a burden. I cried for all the times I'd apologized for needing things that were rightfully mine. I cried for the birthdays they'd ignored while counting money they'd stolen from me. But most of all, I cried for the naive woman I'd been just minutes earlier, the woman who still believed that family meant love, that sacrifice was appreciated, that the people closest to her would never hurt her in ways that cut so deep. Anna and Thomas stood there watching me cry, and neither of them moved to comfort me. Neither of them apologized. Neither of them showed even a flicker of remorse for what they'd done, or guilt for how their actions had affected me. That's when something inside me changed forever. Sitting in that musty basement, surrounded by the evidence of their betrayal, I felt something I'd never experienced before. A cold, clean anger that burned away all my fears and doubts and desperate need to be loved. For the first time in my life, I was done being a victim. I stood up slowly, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. When I looked at Anna and Thomas, I saw them not as family, but as strangers who had worn familiar faces while they robbed me blind. "Pack your things," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "Both of you. I want you out of my apartment by tomorrow." "Eleanor, you're overreacting," Anna started, but I held up my hand to stop her. "Out," I repeated. "Tomorrow. And don't you dare take anything that doesn't belong to you, because I'll be watching every move you make." I climbed the stairs on legs that felt stronger with each step. Behind me, I could hear them whispering frantically, but I didn't care what they were saying. I didn't care about their plans or their excuses or their attempts to minimize what they'd done. I was done caring what they thought about anything. For the first time in years, I locked my bedroom door that night. I sat on my bed, staring at the photograph on my nightstand, the one of Anna and me as little girls, holding hands and laughing. I picked it up and studied our young faces, trying to find some trace of the woman my sister had become in that innocent child's eyes. But all I could see was the sister I'd lost somewhere along the way, replaced by a stranger who saw me as nothing more than a source of money and free labor. I opened my dresser drawer and placed the photograph face down inside, covering it with old scarves and sweaters I never wore anymore. Some memories are too painful to look at every day. The next morning, I called my bank and the police. I changed all my passwords, canceled all my cards, and requested detailed statements showing every transaction made on my accounts for the past 5 years. I wanted to know exactly how much they'd stolen, exactly how many lies they'd told, exactly how long they'd been making a fool of me. But even as I took these first steps toward reclaiming my life, I was terrified. At 72 years old, I was about to be completely alone for the first time in decades. No husband, no sister, no one who needed me or pretended to care about me. Just me, in an apartment that would feel enormous and empty without the sound of other people moving through it. That fear almost made me pick up the phone and tell them they could stay. That fear almost made me apologize for overreacting, for causing trouble, for not being grateful enough for their help with my finances. Almost. But not quite. Because I'd finally learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. I'd been lonely for years while living with people who didn't love or respect me. Being alone might actually be an improvement. The confrontation came that evening, exactly as I'd expected it would. Anna and Thomas hadn't packed anything. Instead, they'd spent the day plotting some new strategy to manipulate me into backing down. Anna came to my bedroom door first, armed with tears and apologies and promises that things would be different if I just gave them another chance. Her mascara was smudged in a way that looked almost theatrical, and her voice trembled with the kind of practiced vulnerability she'd used on me countless times before. "Eleanor, sweetheart, I know you're upset, but we need to talk about this rationally," she said, settling beside me on my bed uninvited. "You're my sister. You're all the family I have left in this world. We can't let a misunderstanding come between us." A misunderstanding. As if years of systematic theft and emotional manipulation could be dismissed as a simple miscommunication. "There's no misunderstanding, Anna," I replied, my voice surprisingly calm. "You stole from me. You lied to me. You used my identity to commit insurance fraud. You made me feel like a burden while you were getting rich off money that belonged to me. I understand the situation perfectly." Her tears dried up remarkably quickly. "Fine," she said, her voice turning cold. "You want to play hardball? You're making a huge mistake, Eleanor. You need us more than we need you. Who's going to take care of you when your arthritis gets worse? Who's going to drive you to doctor's appointments when you can't manage on your own anymore? You think you're being strong and independent, but you're just being stupid and stubborn." The words were designed to hurt, to make me doubt myself, to reawaken the fears that had kept me trapped in their web of manipulation for so long. But instead of feeling afraid, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Relief that the mask had finally come off. that I no longer had to wonder if I was imagining the coldness in her voice or the calculation in her eyes. "I'll manage," I said simply. Thomas tried a different approach when his turn came. He stood in my doorway looking tired and defeated, his shoulders slumped like a man carrying a heavy burden. "Eleanor, you have to understand the pressure I've been under," he began, using the same excuse he'd relied on for years to justify his treatment of me. "When I lost my job, I panicked. I didn't know how we were going to survive. When Anna suggested investing your mother's inheritance, it seemed like the smart thing to do. We were trying to protect you, to make sure you'd be taken care of in your old age. By lying to me? By forging my signature? By making me feel like I was a financial burden while you were living off my money? We were going to tell you eventually," he said, and I almost laughed at the transparency of the lie. "We wanted to surprise you when the investments really paid off. We wanted you to be proud of how much we'd accomplished." "I am proud," I said. "I'm proud of myself for finally seeing through your lies. I'm proud of myself for finding the courage to say no to people who don't deserve my yes. I'm proud of myself for choosing my own dignity over your convenience." His expression shifted then, from false remorse to genuine anger. "You're going to regret this, Eleanor. You think you're so smart, so independent. But you're just a bitter old woman who's going to die alone because she drove away everyone who ever cared about her." The words hit their target, sending a spike of pain through my heart. But the pain was different now. Cleaner somehow, less poisonous than the constant ache of betrayal I'd been carrying around for years. "Maybe you're right," I said. "Maybe I will die alone. But at least I'll die with my dignity intact. At least I'll die knowing I stopped letting people treat me like I don't matter." He left without another word, slamming my bedroom door so hard the pictures on the wall rattled. But the sound didn't frighten me the way his anger once had. Instead, it sounded like the punctuation mark at the end of a very long, painful sentence. They were both gone by the end of the week, taking only their personal belongings and leaving behind the apartment we'd shared for 12 years. They also left behind a mess of legal documents, forged papers, and evidence of financial crimes that I had to sort through with the help of a lawyer and an accountant. The numbers were staggering. Over the course of 5 years, they'd grown my mother's $50,000 inheritance into a portfolio worth nearly $3 million. They'd invested in tech stocks, cryptocurrency, real estate, and commodities, making smart financial decisions that I never would have known how to make on my own. But they'd also been skimming money off the top, paying themselves management fees that totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars. They'd used my credit cards for personal purchases, taken out loans in my name, and committed various forms of fraud that could have landed me in prison if I'd been caught. "You're incredibly wealthy, Mrs. Williams," my lawyer told me. A sharp young woman named Maria Santos who'd grown up in the Bronx and understood exactly what it meant to be underestimated because of your age and background. "But you're also incredibly lucky that your sister and husband were competent criminals. A lot of people in their situation would have just stolen everything and disappeared. The fact that they actually grew your wealth while they were stealing from you probably saved you from complete financial ruin. Lucky. I suppose that was one way to look at it. Lucky that my family members were accomplished thieves. Lucky that they'd left me wealthy enough to hire lawyers and accountants to clean up their mess. Lucky that their crimes had been sophisticated enough to avoid detection for 5 years. What happens now? I asked. Now you decide whether you want to press charges, Maria said. The evidence is overwhelming. They could both face significant prison time for what they've done. Or you could choose to handle this civilly, recover what they owe you, and move on with your life. Prison time. The thought of Anna and Thomas behind bars should have given me satisfaction, but instead, it just made me feel tired. They'd already stolen so much of my life, so much of my peace. Did I really want to spend what years I had left fighting them in court, reliving their betrayal over and over again in depositions and trials? I need time to think about it, I said. That night, Alone in my apartment for the first time in over a decade, I made myself dinner. Just a simple meal of soup and sandwiches, and ate it at my kitchen table. The silence felt different now, no longer oppressive, but somehow spacious, full of possibilities I hadn't considered in years. I could eat whatever I wanted for dinner without having to consider anyone else's preferences. I could watch whatever television programs appealed to me without negotiating or compromising. I could spend my money, my own money, on things that brought me joy instead of constantly worrying about whether I was being too selfish or extravagant. For the first time in years, I felt free. But freedom, I learned, is more complicated than it looks in movies and books. Freedom means making your own choices, but it also means living with the consequences of those choices. Freedom means not having to answer to anyone, but it also means not having anyone to answer to you. The apartment felt enormous without Anna's clutter and Thomas's presence. Every room echoed with memories of the life we'd shared, some genuinely happy, most tainted now by the knowledge of what they'd really thought of me all along. I found myself jumping at every small sound, every creak of the floorboards, every siren in the distance. One particularly difficult night, about a week after they'd moved out, I almost called Anna. I sat with the phone in my hand for nearly an hour, staring at her number in my contacts, my finger hovering over the call button. What would I say? That I'd changed my mind? That I was sorry for overreacting? That I missed her despite everything she'd done to me? But then I remembered the sound of her laughter in that basement, the casual cruelty in her voice when she talked about how pathetic I was. I remembered the way she'd looked at me when she thought I couldn't see. Not with love or even basic respect, but with the kind of calculating assessment you might give a resource you were trying to figure out how to exploit. I put the phone down and made myself a cup of tea instead. The turning point came 3 weeks later when my youngest granddaughter Lily showed up at my door. I hadn't seen her in months. Anna had been the gatekeeper for family visits, and she'd gradually reduced my contact with the younger generation to brief, supervised encounters that always left me feeling more isolated than before. But Lily had apparently been asking questions about where I was and why she wasn't allowed to visit me anymore. When Anna's vague answers didn't satisfy her, she'd taken the subway from Brooklyn to Queens on her own, showing up at my door with a backpack full of art supplies and a determination to spend the afternoon with her grandmother. "Grandma Eleanor," she said, throwing her arms around me with the unself-conscious affection that only 18-year-olds possess. "I've missed you so much. Mom said you were sick, but you look fine to me." Sick. Of course, that's what Anna had told everyone. Poor Eleanor is having health problems. Poor Eleanor is confused and doesn't want visitors. Poor Eleanor needs to be protected from the stress of too much social interaction. "I'm feeling much better now," I told Lily, which was true in ways she couldn't possibly understand. We spent the afternoon together, just the two of us, talking and laughing in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Lily told me about college, about her art classes, about the boy she had a crush on who didn't know she existed. She showed me her sketchbook, filled with drawings of city scenes and portraits of people she'd observed on the subway. "You're so talented," I told her and meant it. Her drawings had a life and energy that reminded me of my own artistic aspirations from decades ago, dreams I'd set aside to focus on being a wife and taking care of everyone else's needs. "I want to apply to art school after I finish my degree," she said, then hesitated. "But Mom says it's not practical. She says I need to study something that will guarantee me a job, like accounting or nursing." How many times had I heard similar advice over the years? How many dreams had been sacrificed on the altar of practicality and other people's expectations? "Lily," I said carefully, "what do you think would happen if you followed your passion instead of someone else's idea of what's practical?" She considered the question seriously. "I might fail," she admitted. "But I might also create something beautiful. I might also be happy." That conversation planted a seed in my mind that grew over the following days. What would happen if I followed my own passion instead of spending the rest of my life mourning what I'd lost? What would happen if I used my newfound wealth and freedom to create something beautiful for myself? I'd always loved art, but had never had the time or resources to pursue it seriously. I'd painted watercolors occasionally when I was younger, but that hobby had fallen by the wayside as life became more complicated and demanding. Now, suddenly, I had both time and money to explore creative pursuits I'd only dreamed about before. On impulse, I signed up for an art class at the local community center in Jackson Heights. The neighborhood was a vibrant mix of cultures and languages, full of small businesses and restaurants that catered to immigrants from all over the world. The streets hummed with energy and possibility, a stark contrast to the insular, suffocating atmosphere I'd been living in for years. My first day of class was terrifying. I walked into a bright, airy room filled with easels and art supplies, surrounded by people who seemed to know exactly what they were doing, while I felt like an imposter who had no business being there. But the instructor, a woman named Carmen who'd immigrated from Peru and spoke with the kind of accent that reminded me of the diversity I'd always loved about New York, welcomed me with genuine warmth. Art is not about being perfect, she told the class during our first session. Art is about being honest, about expressing what's inside you even if it's messy or confusing or painful. The most beautiful paintings come from the most authentic places. I picked up a brush for the first time in decades and felt something inside me wake up. The watercolors flowed across the paper like liquid emotions, creating shapes and colors that seemed to emerge from some deep place I'd forgotten existed. I wasn't painting anything recognizable, just abstract washes of blue and purple and gold that somehow captured the feeling of freedom I'd been experiencing. It wasn't good art, by any technical standard, but it was mine. It came from me, expressed something that belonged to me alone, represented choices I was making for reasons that had nothing to do with pleasing other people or meeting their expectations. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. The weeks passed in a blur of new experiences and small revelations. I bought myself new clothes, not practical outfits designed to hide my aging body, but colorful dresses and scarves that made me feel vibrant and alive. I replaced the heavy, dark curtains in my apartment with light, airy panels that let in the sunshine I'd been blocking out for years. I started cooking meals that I actually wanted to eat instead of dishes designed to please other people. I discovered that I loved spicy food, ethnic cuisines I'd never tried before, fresh vegetables from the farmer's market that tasted like sunshine and earth and possibility. I began taking long walks through my neighborhood, really seeing it for the first time in years. Queens is an incredibly diverse borough, full of small communities that maintain their cultural traditions while adapting to American life. I found myself stopping to admire window displays in shops run by families from Bangladesh, stopping for coffee at cafes where the baristas spoke Spanish and Greek and Arabic with customers who had become their friends. The world was so much bigger and more interesting than the small, fearful existence I'd been living. How had I forgotten that? But the real transformation happened gradually, in small moments that added up to something larger than their individual parts. I started speaking up for myself in situations where I previously would have remained silent. When a grocery store clerk was rude to me, I asked to speak to his manager instead of apologizing for taking up his time. When a doctor kept me waiting for over an hour without explanation, I rescheduled my appointment instead of accepting that my time didn't matter. I learned to say no without guilt, to set boundaries without apology, to prioritize my own needs without feeling selfish. It was harder than it sounds. I'd spent decades training myself to be accommodating, to put everyone else's comfort ahead of my own, to believe that my wants and needs were somehow less important than other people's. But with practice, it got easier. And with each small act of self-advocacy, I felt stronger and more confident in my right to take up space in the world. About 2 months after Anna and Thomas had moved out, I got an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Delgado, who lived across the hall, knocked on my door one evening with a plate of homemade empanadas and a shy smile. "I hope you don't mind me bothering you," she said in accented English, "but I wanted to check on you. I noticed your sister and her husband moved out, and I was worried you might be lonely." Mrs. Delgado was a woman around my age who'd emigrated from Dominican Republic with her late husband 30 years earlier. She'd raised 4 children in America, working as a seamstress while her husband drove a taxi, and had managed to create a life of dignity and purpose, despite facing challenges I could only imagine. We'd been neighbors for years, exchanging polite greetings and small talk about the weather, but we'd never really had a conversation. Anna had always dismissed her as that woman from across the hall, with the kind of casual prejudice that embarrassed me, but that I'd been too cowardly to challenge. Now, sitting in my kitchen sharing her delicious food and listening to her stories about her grandchildren, I realized what I'd been missing. Mrs. Delgado, Rosa, was funny and wise and generous, in a way that had nothing to do with expecting anything in return. She told me about her work with a local nonprofit that helped immigrant families navigate the healthcare system, about her hobby of creating elaborate quilts that she donated to homeless shelters, about her dream of visiting her sister in Miami now that her children were grown and settled. "You seem different," she observed during one of our conversations. "Happier, more yourself, if that makes sense." It made perfect sense. I was more myself than I'd been in years, maybe in decades. I was discovering parts of my personality that had been buried under years of trying to be what other people needed me to be instead of who I actually was. But the real test of my transformation came 3 months later, when Anna called. I was in the middle of a painting, a watercolor landscape inspired by a photo I'd taken during a solo trip to Central Park, when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it, but something made me pick up. "Eleanor?" Anna's voice was small and uncertain, nothing like the confident manipulator I'd confronted in the basement. "It's me. I was hoping we could talk." My first instinct was to hang up. My second was to tell her exactly what I thought of her and her fake apology, but something in her tone made me pause. "I'm listening," I said carefully. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me," she began, "but I wanted you to know that Thomas and I are. We're not together anymore. He left me last month, took whatever money he could access and disappeared. I haven't heard from him since." I felt a complex mix of emotions: satisfaction that their partnership in crime had fallen apart, sympathy for the betrayal she was experiencing, and a familiar urge to comfort her that I had to consciously resist. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. Not because I wanted Thomas back in either of our lives, but because being abandoned is painful no matter what the circumstances. "Eleanor, I know I hurt you," Anna continued. "I know what we did was wrong. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I was wondering, could we maybe meet for coffee? Just to talk? I miss you. I miss having my sister in my life." The words I'd been waiting to hear for months, the apology I'd dreamed of receiving, the acknowledgement that she'd been wrong and I'd been right to stand up for myself. But instead of the relief and validation I'd expected to feel, I found myself analyzing her words with a clarity that surprised me. She missed having me in her life, but did she miss me, specifically, or did she miss what I'd provided for her? Was this genuine remorse, or was this another manipulation designed to get me back under her control? "Anna," I said slowly, "why are you calling me now? What's changed?" The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. Then she spoke again, her voice even smaller than before. "I'm scared, Eleanor. I don't know how to take care of myself. I don't know how to manage money or pay bills or make decisions on my own. I need help." There it was, the truth behind the apology. She wasn't calling because she missed me, or because she'd genuinely recognized the harm she'd caused. She was calling because she needed something from me, just like always. The old Eleanor would have dropped everything to rescue her. The old Eleanor would have seen her sister's vulnerability as an opportunity to be needed again, to matter in someone's life, to earn love through service and sacrifice. But the new Eleanor, the woman who'd learned to value herself, who'd discovered her own worth didn't depend on other people's approval, felt something different entirely. "Anna," I said gently, "I hope you figure things out. I hope you learn to take care of yourself and make good choices and build a life you can be proud of. But I can't help you anymore. I can't be who I used to be in your life." "But I'm your sister," she whispered, playing the family card one last time. "Yes, you are, and I love you. But loving you doesn't mean letting you treat me badly. Loving you doesn't mean sacrificing my peace and dignity to enable your mistakes. Sometimes loving someone means saying no to them, even when it hurts." I hung up the phone and sat quietly for a few minutes, processing what had just happened. I'd said no to my sister's request for help, something I'd never done before in my life. I'd chosen my own well-being over her convenience, my own peace over her crisis. It should have felt terrible. It should have filled me with guilt and regret, and desperate doubt about whether I was doing the right thing. Instead, it felt like freedom. That evening, Rosa knocked on my door with more food. She'd made too much rice and beans, she claimed, though I suspected she'd made extra specifically to share with me. We ate together at my kitchen table, talking about our art classes and the books we were reading, and the dreams we were finally old enough and brave enough to pursue. "You know," Rosa said as we finished our meal, "I used to think getting older meant life got smaller, that there would be fewer choices, fewer opportunities, fewer chances to become who we're supposed to be." "And now?" I asked. She smiled, her weathered hands graceful as she poured us both another cup of coffee. "Now I think maybe we spend the first part of our lives becoming who other people need us to be. And if we're lucky, we get to spend the second part becoming who we actually are." Who I actually was, it turned out, was someone I was just beginning to meet. I was an artist who painted terrible watercolors that made me ridiculously happy. I was a woman who looked good in bright colors and didn't apologize for taking up space. I was someone who could say no without guilt and yes without reservation, who could love people without enabling them, who could be alone without being lonely. I was someone who had spent over 70 years learning to be herself, and who finally had the wisdom and courage to embrace what she'd learned. 6 months after Anna and Thomas moved out, I made a decision that would have terrified the old Eleanor, but felt perfectly natural to the new one. I decided to travel. I'd never gone anywhere by myself before. Every trip I'd taken had been with family or centered around family obligations, visiting relatives, attending weddings or funerals, helping with crises that required my presence and assistance. The idea of going somewhere purely for my own enjoyment, of spending money on experiences rather than other people's needs, had seemed impossibly selfish. But I had money now, my own money, managed by financial advisors I'd chosen myself, invested in ways that aligned with my values and goals. I had time now, days that belonged to me rather than being consumed by other people's demands and expectations. I had freedom now. The terrifying, exhilarating freedom that comes from finally learning that you don't need anyone's permission to live your own life. I planned a trip to Maine, to see the rocky coastline and lighthouses I'd dreamed about for decades, but never found the time or courage to visit. I booked a small bed and breakfast in a village whose name I'd seen in travel magazines, made reservations at restaurants that specialized in fresh seafood, and bought a new suitcase, bright blue instead of the sensible black I'd always chosen before. The morning I left for Maine, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror applying lipstick in a shade of coral that Rosa had convinced me to try. The woman looking back at me was someone I barely recognized, confident, stylish, excited about the adventure ahead, rather than anxious about problems that might arise. "Have a wonderful time, Eleanor," I told my reflection. "You deserve this. You deserve all of it." The trip was everything I'd hoped it would be and more. I watched the sunrise over the ocean from my room at the inn, breathed air that tasted like salt and possibility, ate lobster rolls that were worth every penny I spent on them. I walked along rocky beaches collecting smooth stones that caught the light in interesting ways. I bought postcards that I sent to myself instead of to family members who wouldn't appreciate them anyway. But the most powerful moment came on my last evening in Maine, as I sat on a restaurant deck overlooking the harbor, sharing a bottle of wine with a lovely couple from California who'd struck up a conversation with me at the bar. They were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary, and their obvious affection for each other might have made me feel sad about my own failed marriage. Instead, I found myself feeling grateful. Grateful that I'd learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. Grateful that I'd discovered I could be excellent company for myself. Grateful that I'd finally stopped waiting for other people to give my life meaning and had started creating meaning on my own. "What's your secret?" the woman asked me as we watched the sun set over the water. "You seem so content, so at peace with yourself. I hope I'm that happy when I'm your age." I almost laughed. Happy. 6 months ago, I'd thought happiness was something that happened to other people, something I might achieve if I just tried hard enough to please everyone around me. "I learned to stop waiting for other people to treat me well," I told her. "I learned to treat myself well instead." When I returned to Queens, my apartment felt like home in a way it never had before. Not because anything physical had changed, but because I had changed. I'd learned that home isn't a place where other people want you. It's a place where you want to be. Lily was waiting for me when I got back, eager to hear about my trip and share her own news. She'd decided to apply to art school after all, inspired partly by our conversations and partly by her own growing confidence in her artistic abilities. "I realized you were right," she told me as we looked through the photos from my main adventure. "I might fail if I follow my passion, but I'll definitely fail if I don't try. And even if I don't become a famous artist, at least I'll be doing something that makes me feel alive." Alive. Such a simple word, but it captured exactly what I'd been feeling since I'd learned to put my own well-being first. For years, I'd been surviving, getting through each day, managing other people's problems, quietly enduring treatment that diminished me. Now, finally, I was living. The legal issues from Anna and Thomas's crimes were eventually resolved through civil proceedings rather than criminal ones. I recovered most of the money they'd stolen, and the investments they'd made in my name continued to grow under the management of advisors who actually had my best interests at heart. But more importantly, I'd recovered something much more valuable than money: my sense of self-worth. My understanding that I deserved to be treated with respect and kindness, not just by others, but by myself. My knowledge that I was worthy of love, not because of what I could provide, but because of who I was. Anna called a few more times over the following months, always when she was facing some crisis that she needed my help to resolve. Each time, I listened politely and offered emotional support, while firmly declining to provide financial assistance or get drawn back into the drama of her chaotic life. The last time she called, her tone was different, less desperate, more resigned. "I think I'm finally starting to understand," she said. "You're not going to rescue me anymore. You're not going to let me take advantage of you anymore." "No," I agreed. "I'm not." "I don't like it," she admitted. "I don't like having to figure things out on my own, but I think maybe it's good for me, good for both of us." Maybe it was. Maybe learning to stand on our own feet, to solve our own problems, to take responsibility for our own choices, was exactly what both of us needed to do. I never heard from Thomas again, and I found that I didn't care where he was or what he was doing. He'd been a chapter in my life that was over now. Finished, filed away in the part of my memory reserved for experiences that had taught me important lessons, but no longer had the power to hurt me. A year after my transformation began, I was painting in my art class when Carmen made an announcement that changed my life yet again. "I'm organizing a group show," she told us, her eyes bright with excitement. "A chance for all of you to display your work publicly, to share what you've created with the community. Who's interested in participating?" The old Eleanor would have demurred, would have insisted that her work wasn't good enough, would have been paralyzed by the fear of being judged or criticized. But the new Eleanor raised her hand without hesitation. "I am," I said, my voice clear and confident. "I'd love to show my work." The opening night of the art show was one of the most terrifying and exhilarating evenings of my life. I wore a dress in the same coral shade as the lipstick Rosa had encouraged me to try, and I'd spent hours arranging and rearranging my paintings until they told the story I wanted to tell. A story of transformation, of discovery, of a woman learning to see herself clearly for the first time. Rosa came to support me, bringing along several friends from her quilting group who admired my watercolors and asked thoughtful questions about my techniques and inspirations. Lily came too, beaming with pride as she introduced me to her friends as my grandmother, the artist. But the most meaningful moment came when a young woman approached one of my paintings, an abstract piece I'd titled "Breaking Free" that used bold blues and purples to represent the moment I'd decided to reclaim my life. "This one speaks to me," she said quietly. "It looks like what courage feels like." Courage. I'd never thought of myself as courageous before. Courage was for police officers and firefighters and soldiers, not for elderly women learning to paint and travel alone and say no to family members who'd taken advantage of them for years. But maybe courage comes in different forms. Maybe courage is choosing to value yourself when everyone around you suggests you shouldn't. Maybe courage is starting over at 72, learning new skills, making new friends, creating new dreams when the old ones have been shattered. Maybe courage is simply refusing to settle for less than you deserve, even when, especially when, it means standing alone. 2 years have passed since I locked Anna and Thomas in that basement and called the police. 2 years since I discovered that the people I'd trusted most in the world had been systematically stealing from me while convincing me I was lucky to have them in my life. Those 2 years have been the most challenging and rewarding of my entire existence. I've learned to manage my own finances, to navigate legal systems, to make decisions based on my own judgment rather than other people's expectations. I've traveled to places I'd only dreamed of visiting, eaten foods I'd never heard of, had conversations with people whose perspectives have expanded my understanding of the world. I've also learned to be comfortable with solitude in ways I never thought possible. My apartment is no longer silent with the oppressive quiet of neglect and abandonment. It hums with the peaceful silence of contentment and self-sufficiency. I wake up each morning not with dread about who might need something from me, but with anticipation about what I might discover or create or experience. My relationship with Lily has deepened into the kind of genuine friendship that transcends generational boundaries. She's in art school now, thriving in ways that make my heart sing with pride and joy. She visits me regularly, not out of obligation or because anyone is forcing her to, but because she genuinely enjoys my company and values our conversations. "You're different from other grandmothers," she told me recently as we painted together in my living room. "You're more like a friend who happens to be older. You don't try to control me or judge me or make me feel bad for wanting things that other people think are impractical." That might be the best compliment I've ever received, being seen as someone who supports rather than controls, who encourages rather than diminishes, who loves without conditions or expectations. Rosa has become the sister I always thought I had in Anna, but never actually did. We share meals and books and art supplies and dreams. We've traveled together to places neither of us had ever imagined we'd see. A quilting festival in Pennsylvania, a watercolor workshop in Vermont, a weekend in Washington, D.C., where we toured museums and monuments like the tourists we'd never had the freedom to be when we were younger. "You saved my life," I told Rosa one evening as we sat on my fire escape watching the sunset paint the Queen's skyline in shades of gold and pink. "No," she said with the gentle wisdom that had drawn me to her in the first place. "You saved your own life. I just helped you remember that it was worth saving." Worth saving. Such a simple concept, but one I'd forgotten somewhere along the way. I'd spent so many years believing that my value came from what I could provide for other people. My money, my time, my endless capacity for forgiveness and sacrifice. That I'd lost sight of the fact that I had intrinsic worth just for being who I was. Now I know better. Now I know that I deserve respect not because I've earned it through servitude, but because I'm a human being with thoughts and feelings and dreams that matter. I know that I deserve love not because I've purchased it with my resources and labor, but because I'm worthy of affection simply for existing. Most importantly, I know that I don't need anyone else's approval or validation to live a meaningful life. The meaning comes from within, from the choices I make, the values I uphold, the kindness I show to myself and others, the beauty I create and appreciate and share with the world. My art has improved dramatically over the past 2 years. I'll never be a master painter, but my watercolors now capture emotions and experiences in ways that surprise and delight me. I've sold several pieces through local galleries, not because I need the money, but because there's something magical about creating something that speaks to other people, something that helps them feel less alone in their own struggles and transformations. But my greatest masterpiece isn't hanging on any wall or displayed in any gallery. It's the life I've built for myself. The quiet, peaceful, purposeful existence that reflects my values and priorities rather than other people's demands and expectations. Last month, I received a letter that tested my resolve in ways I hadn't anticipated. It was from Thomas, forwarded through my lawyer's office, asking for forgiveness and reconciliation. He claimed he'd found religion, that he understood now how wrong he'd been, that he wanted to make amends for the pain he'd caused. The letter was written in his familiar handwriting, full of the flowery language he'd always used when he was trying to manipulate me into giving him what he wanted. He talked about our sacred bond of marriage, about the vows we'd taken for better or worse, about how God wanted us to forgive each other and start fresh. Reading it, I felt a familiar flutter of the old emotions, the urge to give him another chance, to believe his promises of change, to prioritize his needs over my own peace and security. For a moment, I could imagine myself writing back, agreeing to meet with him, slowly sliding back into the patterns that had nearly destroyed my sense of self. But then I looked around my apartment, at my paintings on the walls, at the photos from my travels, at the books I was reading, because I wanted to read them, rather than because someone else thought I should. I thought about the life I'd built, the friendships I'd cultivated, the dreams I was pursuing simply because they brought me joy. I folded Thomas's letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer, not because I intended to respond to it, but because I wanted to remember the moment I chose myself over the familiar pain of trying to fix someone else. Some chapters are finished. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Some relationships serve their purpose and then end, not because anyone is evil or irredeemable, but because the cost of continuing them becomes higher than the benefit they provide. I'm 74 years old now, and I've finally learned one of life's most important lessons. You can love people without letting them hurt you. You can wish them well without sacrificing your own well-being. You can hope for their healing and happiness while maintaining the boundaries that protect your peace. Carmen announced last week that she's retiring from teaching, moving back to Peru to be closer to her aging parents. The news filled me with sadness. She's been such an important part of my transformation, such a source of encouragement and wisdom during the most challenging period of my life. But it also filled me with gratitude for the time we've had together, for the lessons she's taught me about honesty and authenticity, and the courage to express what's inside you even when it's messy or confusing or painful. At her farewell party, surrounded by the students whose lives she'd touched over the years, Carmen pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Eleanor," she said, her eyes bright with the same warmth that had welcomed me to class that first terrifying day. "I want you to know how proud I am of you. When you first walked into my classroom, you were carrying so much pain, so much doubt about your own worth. Now look at you, confident, creative, living life on your own terms. You've become the woman you were always meant to be. The woman I was always meant to be. What a beautiful way to think about transformation, not as becoming someone new, but as finally having the courage to be who you actually are, underneath all the roles and expectations and fears that have been layered on top of your authentic self." That night, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and my watercolors, working on a painting of the view from Carmen's classroom window, the bustling street scene that had become so familiar to me over the years, full of people from different cultures pursuing their own dreams and struggles and small victories. As I painted, I thought about all the women my age who might be sitting alone tonight, wondering if it's too late to change, too late to choose themselves, too late to demand the respect and kindness they deserve. Women who've been told they're too old to start over, too set in their ways to learn new skills, too dependent on others to make it on their own. To those women, I want to say, it's never too late. It's never too late to recognize your own worth, to set boundaries that protect your peace, to pursue dreams that bring you joy. It's never too late to stop accepting treatment that diminishes you, to stop making yourself smaller so other people can feel bigger, to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. The scariest thing about choosing yourself is that you might have to do it alone, at least at first. People who've benefited from your selflessness won't support your transformation. Family members who've taken advantage of your generosity won't celebrate your newfound boundaries. Friends who've grown comfortable with your role as the giver in the relationship won't be happy when you start expecting reciprocity. But here's what I've learned. Being alone with your dignity intact is infinitely better than being surrounded by people who don't truly see or value you. Solitude chosen from a place of self-respect feels nothing like loneliness imposed by other people's neglect. And often, once you start valuing yourself, you attract people who value you too. Once you stop accepting crumbs of affection and attention, you make space for the real thing. Once you stop pouring your energy into relationships that drain you, you have energy available for connections that nourish and sustain you. Rosa, Lily, Carmen, my fellow artists, the neighbors who've become genuine friends. These relationships didn't exist when I was focused entirely on trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it. They emerged when I started believing I deserved better and acting accordingly. 6 months ago, I decided to do something I'd dreamed about for decades but never had the courage to attempt. I wrote a letter to the editor of our local newspaper, sharing my story and encouraging other older adults to recognize the signs of financial and emotional abuse from family members. The response was overwhelming. I received dozens of letters and emails from people who'd experienced similar betrayals, who'd felt guilty for setting boundaries with relatives, who'd wondered if they were being too sensitive or demanding when they asked for basic respect and consideration. Many of these people were dealing with situations that made my experience with Anna and Thomas look relatively minor. Adult children who'd stolen their parents' identities, spouses who'd hidden assets and debts, siblings who'd manipulated their way into power of attorney arrangements that left their relatives with no control over their own lives. Reading their stories broke my heart, but also filled me with determination. If my willingness to speak openly about what I'd experienced could help even one person recognize their own worth and find the courage to make changes, then sharing my painful truth would be worthwhile. I started volunteering with a local organization that provides support and resources for older adults dealing with financial abuse and family manipulation. It's difficult work, listening to stories that are often worse than my own, helping people navigate complex legal and emotional situations, watching some people find the strength to change their circumstances, while others remain trapped by fear and misplaced loyalty. But it's also deeply meaningful work. There's something powerful about transforming your own pain into a source of healing for others, about using your hard-won wisdom to light the way for people who are still stumbling in the darkness you've learned to navigate. Last week, I received a phone call that reminded me why this work matters. It was from a woman named Betty, 68 years old, who'd read my letter to the editor 6 months earlier, but had been too scared to reach out until now. "I think my son is stealing from me," she whispered into the phone, her voice shaking with fear and shame. "I think he's been forging my signature on checks, using my credit cards, taking money from my accounts. But he's my son. He's all I have left in the world. I don't know what to do." I spent an hour on the phone with Betty, listening to her story, validating her concerns, helping her understand that love doesn't require accepting abuse, and that protecting herself didn't mean she loved her son any less. By the end of our conversation, she'd agreed to meet with a lawyer and start documenting the evidence of her son's theft. "Thank you," she said before hanging up. "Thank you for showing me that I'm not crazy, that I don't have to accept this treatment just because he's family. Thank you for proving that women like us can survive and even thrive when we choose ourselves." Women like us. I love that phrase. It acknowledges that while our specific circumstances may differ, we share something essential. The experience of discovering our own worth later in life, the courage to demand better treatment even when it's scary, the willingness to start over when starting over seems impossible. Yesterday was my 75th birthday. For the first time in decades, I didn't wait for other people to remember or celebrate. Instead, I planned my own party, a small gathering with Rosa, Lily, and a few close friends from my art class and volunteer work. We met at a restaurant in Flushing that serves the best dumplings in Queens, a place I'd discovered during one of my solo adventures around the borough. The conversation was lively and genuine, full of laughter and shared stories and plans for future adventures. When it came time for cake, a beautiful creation covered in edible flowers that Lily had ordered from a bakery in her neighborhood, Rosa stood up to make a toast. "To Eleanor," she said, raising her glass of wine, "who taught all of us that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. Who showed us that loving ourselves isn't selfish, it's necessary. Who proved that the most beautiful transformations happen when we finally stop waiting for other people's permission to live our own lives." Everyone raised their glasses, and for a moment I was overwhelmed by the love and respect I saw in their faces. Not love based on what I could provide for them, but genuine affection for who I was as a person. Not respect earned through years of sacrifice and service, but recognition of my inherent dignity and worth. After the party, I came home to my quiet apartment and sat with my watercolors, working on a new painting inspired by the evening I'd just experienced. The colors seemed to flow more freely than usual, warm oranges and golds that captured the feeling of generosity and connection, peaceful blues that represented the sense of belonging I'd finally found. As I painted, I thought about the woman I used to be, the Eleanor who woke up every morning apologizing for her existence, who measured her worth by how much she could give away, who believed that love required the complete sacrifice of self. I don't judge that woman harshly anymore. She was doing the best she could with the tools and understanding she had at the time. She was shaped by a culture that taught her to value other people's comfort over her own, by relationships that reinforced the message that she was only as valuable as her usefulness. But I'm grateful every day that she found the strength to change, even when change seemed impossible. I'm grateful that she chose to see clearly rather than continuing to live in denial. I'm grateful that she decided her peace and dignity were worth fighting for, even if it meant fighting alone. The phone rings sometimes. Anna still calls once or twice a year, usually when she's facing some crisis that she thinks I should help her resolve. Her tone has changed over time, becoming less demanding and more genuinely apologetic, but her pattern remains the same. Reach out when she needs something, disappear when life is going well. I listen politely to her updates and challenges. I express appropriate sympathy for her difficulties, and I maintain the boundaries I've established. It's not easy. There's still a part of me that wants to rush in and solve her problems, to buy peace through generosity, to mistake enabling for love. But I've learned that the kindest thing I can do for Anna is to refuse to rescue her from the consequences of her choices. Every time I bail her out, I rob her of the opportunity to develop her own strength and problem-solving skills. Every time I absorb the impact of her poor decisions, I prevent her from learning to make better ones. It's a hard lesson, one that goes against every instinct I developed during my years as the family caretaker. But it's also a necessary one. Real love sometimes requires disappointing people you care about. Real compassion sometimes means saying no to requests for help that would ultimately harm both you and the person making them. Thomas never called again after I didn't respond to his letter. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to Florida, where he was reportedly working construction and living in a small apartment near the coast. I hope he's found peace and happiness in his new life. I hope he's learned to take responsibility for his choices and make amends for the harm he's caused. But mostly, I hope he's learned to find fulfillment in ways that don't require deceiving or taking advantage of other people. That's the wish I have for everyone who's ever hurt me, not suffering or punishment, but genuine transformation that makes future harm impossible. Forgiveness, I've discovered, doesn't require maintaining relationships with people who've hurt you. It doesn't require trusting them again or giving them access to your life or resources. It simply requires releasing the anger and resentment that would otherwise poison your own peace. I've forgiven Anna and Thomas, not because they've earned it, but because carrying anger toward them was like carrying a heavy stone that served no purpose except to weigh me down. Forgiveness freed me from the burden of constantly reliving their betrayals, constantly fueling myself with righteous indignation that ultimately hurt me more than it hurt them. But forgiveness didn't make me naive. It didn't erase the lessons I learned about recognizing manipulation and protecting myself from people who see me as a resource rather than a person. Forgiveness and healthy boundaries aren't contradictory. They're complementary aspects of emotional maturity. 3 years have passed since that night in the basement when my world fell apart and then began to be rebuilt on a foundation of self-respect rather than self-sacrifice. 3 years since I learned to distinguish between love and exploitation, between family loyalty and personal dignity, between being alone and being lonely. If someone had told me then that I'd end up grateful for the betrayal that shattered my illusions, I would have thought they were crazy. But in many ways, that's exactly what happened. Anna and Thomas's crimes against me forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding for decades, to develop strength I didn't know I possessed, to create a life that truly belonged to me rather than existing primarily for other people's benefit. I wouldn't choose to experience that betrayal again, but I also wouldn't trade the woman I became as a result of surviving it. The Eleanor who emerged from that basement, shocked, hurt, but finally angry enough to demand better, was the person I'd been meant to be all along. She was buried under decades of conditioning that taught her to prioritize other people's needs over her own, under a mistaken belief that her worth was measured by how much she could give away. But she was always there, waiting for the right combination of circumstances and courage to emerge. Today, I woke up as I always do now, not with dread about who might need something from me, but with curiosity about what the day might bring. I made my coffee and took my medications and watered my plants, but these routine tasks felt different than they used to. They felt like acts of self-care rather than mere survival. I'm working on a new painting, inspired by the view from my bedroom window at sunrise. The light hits the buildings of Queens in a way that transforms ordinary apartment complexes into something almost magical, full of stories and dreams and possibilities. That's what I love most about watercolors, the way they capture not just what something looks like, but how it feels to really see it. The way they reveal beauty in unexpected places, turn simple moments into something worthy of preservation and celebration. That's what these past 3 years have taught me about life too. There's beauty in starting over at 75. There's magic in learning to value yourself after decades of giving that power away to other people. There's profound satisfaction in creating a life that reflects your own values and priorities, rather than everyone else's expectations. I have everything I need now, not in terms of material possessions, though I'm fortunate to be financially secure, but in terms of the things that actually matter. I have genuine friendships based on mutual respect and affection. I have creative pursuits that bring me joy and a sense of accomplishment. I have work that feels meaningful and contributes something positive to the world. Most importantly, I have a relationship with myself that's built on kindness rather than criticism, on encouragement rather than doubt, on love rather than conditional approval based on performance. I wish I'd learned these lessons earlier in life. I wish I'd had the courage to set boundaries and pursue my dreams and insist on being treated with respect when I was younger and had more time to enjoy the benefits of that wisdom. But I'm grateful I learned them at all. I'm grateful I didn't die without ever discovering my own worth, without ever experiencing the peace that comes from living authentically, without ever knowing what it feels like to be loved for who you are, rather than what you can provide. And I'm especially grateful for the opportunity to share these lessons with other people who might be where I used to be, trapped in relationships that diminish them, confused about why they feel so empty despite giving so much, wondering if it's possible to change patterns that seem carved in stone. It is possible. Change is always possible, no matter how old you are or how entrenched your circumstances seem to be. But it requires courage. The courage to see clearly even when the truth is painful, to act on your own behalf even when other people disapprove, to believe in your worth even when no one around you reflects that belief back to you. If you've listened to my story and recognized something familiar in it, I want you to know that you're not alone. You're not crazy for feeling unappreciated or taken advantage of. You're not selfish for wanting to be treated with kindness and respect. You're not too old or too set in your ways to make changes that could transform your life. You matter. Your dreams matter. Your peace matters. Your happiness matters. Not because you've earned the right to matter through service and sacrifice, but because you're a human being worthy of love and respect simply by virtue of existing. The people who truly love you will support your journey towards self-respect and healthy boundaries, even if it's difficult for them at first. The people who get angry when you start valuing yourself are revealing something important about their motivations. They love what you do for them more than they love who you are. It's okay to disappoint people who've grown comfortable with your role as their personal resource. It's okay to prioritize your own needs after decades of putting everyone else first. It's okay to say no, to set limits, to choose peace over keeping everyone else happy. Most importantly, it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. Never too late to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. Never too late to start treating yourself with the same kindness and consideration you've been giving everyone else. Your story doesn't have to end with you being forgotten, overlooked, or taken for granted. You can write a different ending, one where you matter to yourself even if you don't matter to anyone else. One where you create beauty and meaning and joy simply because you deserve to experience those things. I'm 75 years old, and my life is just beginning. The best chapters are still being written, painted in watercolors that capture not just what I see, but how it feels to finally be free. Have you ever lived through something similar to what I've shared with you today? Have you known someone who discovered their worth later in life? Who found the courage to choose themselves after years of choosing everyone else? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. If this video has touched your heart or helped you see your own situation more clearly, please like it and subscribe to my channel. When we share our stories of transformation and healing, we light the way for other people who are still finding their path to freedom. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply let others know they're not alone in their journey toward dignity and self-respect. Thank you for listening to my heart today. Thank you for allowing me to share the most difficult and beautiful chapter of my life with you. And remember, you are worthy of love, respect, and happiness. Not because of what you can give others, but because of who you are. It's never too late to come home to yourself.